Anime has changed a lot over the years and will continue to change well into the future, for better or for worse. Media tends to reflect the times that it was created, but how much of that change is reflected in the protagonists of those times? In this video, we will be trying to create the most average anime protagonists of early anime. Anime has historically been stereotyped as a boys' club by Western fans, leading a lot of people who would love anime to just not bother. As is becoming our motto on this channel, there is anime for everyone, you just need to know where to look. Cough cough. But has this always been the case? Was early anime for kids or adults? If only there was some way to find out.
I've made a spreadsheet, categorizing every anime we could find from 1910 to 1959.
The first known Japanese animation is said to be Katsudo Sashin, dating back over 100 years to somewhere between 1907 and 1912. But it's hard to find a definitive answer, and we may never truly know. The discovery of Katsudo Sashin happened in 2005, so what else could turn up in an attic or disused theatre? A lot of this earlier history is based on the information we do have, and that has shaped the data we collected. This early era of anime was experimental, and was often focused on actually working out how this technology could be used to do anything. Sometimes pulling on shadow puppetry and using a camera to record the play for an automatic replay. Other times, how to produce a series of images on film that seem to move. The novelty can often be missed and make these earlier anime seem strange and boring to modern viewers. But as we often discuss, it is important to look at the context around something to shape your enjoyment. And the invention of the moving image seems pretty cool. It's a wild west where the rules as we know it don't exist yet. Frame rate, keyframes, in-betweens aren't a thing yet. Honestly, the fact we can see these at all is insane. This is a century-old animation from another country, made by directly stenciling ink on film, and you can watch it on Wikipedia for free. Anime of this era utilized techniques their later iterations evolved beyond. Benshi were live narrators who would provide context of the setting and narrative, and even an explanation of the mechanism of the projectors themselves. They would voice characters, and often act as translators for showings of Western animations. There would also be live music to accompany the visuals, and so the Benshi had to be able to project their voice and time themselves to not be drowned out by the instrumentals. Even as sound was introduced in the 1920s, the Benshi remained popular for a decade more. With the backing of the Japanese government, the 1930s saw this medium become the ideal way to produce propaganda. So we broke down this data into 3 key periods based on this. Each is about the same number of years, which is convenient. 1917 to 1930 is the pre-war period. 1931 to 1944 is the warring period, and 1946 to 1959 is the post-war period. The warring period initially only contained World War II, but that didn't match up with the amount of propaganda seen in the early 1930s. It is likely that this increase was from Japan's invasion of China and the occupation of Manchuria, so we expanded that era to better reflect the presence of war in Japan at the time. Anime of this era is highly military focused, and sometimes educational. But there was still non-propaganda anime being produced, such as Ari-chan, which is about a female ant who discovers a violin. Post-war, we see a shift from military propaganda to advertisements and generally commercial works. A lot of these are adaptations of folklore or traditional tales, as well as more experimental works. There is a tendency to break down anime as pre- and post-Tezuka, and so we wanted to devote a video to that less explored era, because while his impact is great, there was a whole world before that, and it tends to just be lumped together as early anime. The pre-war period saw the rise of the fathers of anime. Oten Shimakawa, who got his start as a political cartoonist in Tokyo Puck. Satoru Kitayama, who directed many of the early anime, and Junichi Kochi, the animator for many of those early anime. These progenitors could have had a far greater impact than we know. Most of Shimakawa's work was lost in an earthquake in 1923, which destroyed his warehouse. But that doesn't mean all hope is lost. Let's work with what remains and crunch those numbers.
Some quick housekeeping since this is a data-focused video. We gathered a lot but not all the data ourselves, and we want to be transparent with how we got all this information. But if you just want to get to the pretty pictures, then skip to the next chapter, which is at this timecode. It all started with a database found online of every anime listed on My Anime List up until early 2023. This was very useful. Thank you, Cooper Union. Links to this dataset are in our sources. This was then reformatted and divided up into date ranges. We also extracted demographic and genre information, which was harder than you'd think. Certain calls had to be made because the database listed all demographics, genres, and themes, and that was a little too much. So, 2 key genres were picked to sum up each anime. We then decided on the actual protagonist data we wanted. Age, gender, hair color, eye color, ethnicity, and sexuality were the 6 we picked. For this era of anime, a lot of that information wasn't super relevant or available at all, but we collected it just in case. While specific ages are the norm for modern anime, for these first decades we decided on child, young adult, and old. Gender was mostly obvious, except for animal characters, which were mostly listed as their species. However, some animals did have a specific gender, for instance being referred to as a father or son. Hair and eye color were pretty skewed towards black because a lot of early anime was in black and white. With animal characters, fur was occasionally classified as hair, and most of the animals had distinctly black or white eye colors, so that was included. Ethnicity was normally contextual, and we used names or design to decide. The majority of these were Japanese, but not all of them, which made the category feel actually useful. For animals, ethnicity was used to record species. Sexuality was pretty irrelevant to most of the anime, however, if a character was depicted with a spouse, this was decided as an indicator of sexuality. This accounted for about 8% of characters listed. Turns out early animation pioneers weren't that interested in depicting romance. Arguably because drawing kissing is hard, but that is unsubstantiated. We decided to exclude Chinese and Korean animation as although this is available data, this video is specifically about the conventions of anime from Japan. We also wanted to choose a singular protagonist, but a lot of these anime don't have protagonists per se. Ensemble casts are common, as are plots that follow a series of events instead of a singular character. When a decision couldn't be made, these were listed as various in the data.
Finally, we got the majority of information from primary sources, which is to say the anime themselves. We collectively watched or skimmed through all 134 entries where possible. It was a real pain in the ass, but we do it for the love of the game. Chances are we missed some anime or miscategorized some entries. We are fallible and had to make a call on pretty much every individual anime. Because of this, we noticed interesting biases towards specific kinds of protagonists and styles of presentation, which would have been less obvious than just the raw data. And you can make your own decisions, because we've made a read-only version of the file. Honestly, spending weeks on data collection is fun, but the idea of someone using that data for their own use really makes my dick hard. We hope to do follow-up videos for every decade after this, but unfortunately the data becomes exponential. The 1980s has over 500 entries, the 2000s over 2000, and so on. So this is a call to support this project. You can do that in 2 ways. First of all, any money we receive from Patreon, Ko-fi, etc. allows us to devote more time to these large projects instead of our boring day jobs. Secondly, if any people would like to help with data collection, please reach out. This is a very specific and time-consuming task, and crowdsourcing the data is pretty much the only viable way for us to do the later years. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's finally meet our protagonists.
Money makes life happy!
To bring our protagonist to life, we needed an artist, so we enlisted the help of art boy extraordinaire Dark Violet Cloud.
Hello.
I created 3 rough mood boards using the data we had collected for reference, as well as sharing the data and the script. We wanted him to have all the information we had while working on the art. This is the pre-war mood board that I sent over. I wanted to make sure I got some reasonably accurate clothing on there, as well as examples from anime of this period. It's supposed to quickly communicate what the data shows. According to the data, the average anime protagonist from 1917 to 1930 is a black-haired, black-eyed person of no specific age and sexuality, but they are Japanese. This era was often in black and white and uses a lot of fables and fairy tales as a narrative basis. This era is also primarily historical comedies, so hopefully that comes through. Viola also did his own research, which is great because we had some level of bias when creating the mood boards, and he would pick up on his own trends or be inspired by different elements. So while he's off doing that, let's explore the data and history a little bit more. This period had 30 anime give or take what we could find and spanned 13 years. It had the least women of the three eras. Samurai were a common theme, and although they were active only 50 years before these were made, they very much pull on folklore and the older, more mythological interpretation of what a samurai was. One of the earliest anime, Namakura Gatana, is a comedy about a samurai whose sword is too dull for him to kill passing civilians, based on the fun historical concept of Sujigiri. Instead, they knock him out and he complains about almost being killed. It is 4 minutes long and consists of a classic 4-act structure, often seen in 4-koma manga. A magazine of the time referred to one scene as being too drawn out, presumably a TikTok user who was isekai'd to 1917 Japan. It has a 5.49 on MAL, ranking it on the same level as Isekai Cheat Magician. At this time, Japan was characterized by a settling of democracy in the wake of the Meiji Restoration, as well as the new influence of Western culture and arts. There was also a post-World War I boom in the economy, but that had already collapsed midway through this period. Partially due to the change in power from Emperor Taisho to Emperor Showa, expansion into Korea, Mongolia, and China also occurred in this era and would lay the groundwork for the following era's nationalism. From this we can see a lot of interesting things. First of all, anime reviewers have always been like that. Secondly, we should be viewing these anime as what they are. First attempts at a very difficult and new art form. The animation is simple, and so are the stories, but that's no less impressive. Unfortunately, much like early animation in the West, preservation wasn't really at the top of anyone's agenda, and less so mid the war to end all wars. So most of the anime from the 1910s are just a sliver of what researchers could find. There could have been hundreds of anime, but in our dataset we just have 6. Most of which are short historical folklore-inspired works. For example, the 1917 anime Urashima Taro is a folklore originating in the 8th century about a man who goes fishing and then is swept away by the waves. He goes on adventures in Ryugyujo, the underwater dragon palace. When he returns, over 100 years has passed. My favourite bit of this adaptation is when he meets a turtle and just yoop. It's also bathed in this red hue. A common money-saving decision of the era was to use cheap-coloured cellophane instead of fancy clear cellulose. This anime was believed to be a work by Seitaro Kitayama while working for Nippon Katsudo Sashin Corporation, but newly discovered magazines bring into question if it is that animation. No doubt it's an adaptation of Urashima Taro, but is it Seitaro Kitayama's work? Who knows? Most of these debates aren't being translated into English, but what we do get to read is fascinating. There's an ironic element of shadow play where we just get the outline of information cast by external sources. Was Namakura Gatana boring because it actually had a runtime of 5 hours but only 3 minutes survived? Or was that reviewer just a dick? We don't know, and the language barrier magnifies it 100 times. Just keep that in mind with all of this. It's data and analysis, but at any moment we could find that everything we based it on was totally off. God, I hope it isn't though, this took months. The 1920s plus 1930 are a slightly more exciting decade with 24 anime in our data. The earliest anime is Norama na Jiji in 1924. We have no data between 1918 and early 1924, presumably because of the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. As far as we know, the catastrophe destroyed a lot of the animation from this period. Speaking of missing data, if you notice any gaps in our data, then feel free to let us know down in the comments. I know for a fact that we're missing some anime, but back to Norama na Jiji, or An Old Fool. It's about an older man bumbling around a city and getting into trouble. It has a really nice papercraft feel with obvious layers of cards stacked on top of each other to create depth. The man himself is made of multiple layers so he can articulate. He's a puppet. Unlike Urashima Taro, this is seemingly a unique story, but with what we know about its production, that being nothing, we can only guess. With all the work put into inventing a medium, they probably didn't think to make a behind-the-scenes tour. Bastards. It's fascinating that during this period, the age of protagonists isn't very set. There are children and adults, and the ambiguity of it all makes the industry feel very young. They aren't targeting a specific demographic because the industry hasn't developed yet. It's just about showing these to anyone who wants to see the magic of the craft. Although almost all the protagonists are men and boys, maybe because most of the artists were men or maybe not. The one exception is 1925's Kanimanji Enji, about a young lady who saves a crab. This is the founding myth of a millennia-old Buddhist temple in Kyoto, but picking that myth was a deliberate choice, and they chose to make an animation telling a story of a kind woman. Towards the end of the decade, animators were already pushing the medium with more complex stories and visuals. 1929's Kobutori is a fantastic example. With detailed adult characters, it stands out amongst the Western animation that was being imported into Japan at the time. The last anime we have for this period is Muramatsuri. This one seems to be a music video or a sing-along for a jazz rendition of a children's song, or at least it's sung by a child. The song itself is called Village Festival, which is the same name as the animation. I think it's supposed to be sweet, but the version we get to watch just shy of 100 years later is a little creepy. You can at least find much better recordings of Swing Nippon jazzing up the melodies on YouTube. The rest of the album is much jazzier too. The audio in this anime really confused me while researching because sources point to the first anime to have sound being 1933's Chikara to Onna no Yoko no Naka, 3 years after Muramatsuri. Actually, on the spreadsheet we have anime with sound as far back as Usagi to Kame in 1924. What's going on here?
As I mentioned earlier, the anime of this period were accompanied by a live orchestra and a benshi to provide sounds and context. Muramatsuri was intended to be a sing-along for the audience, and the audio was recorded separately and added on at a later date. These were known as record talkies and would have the recorded sound played simultaneously to the video. Digital restorations often have the audio added by default, even if it was originally separate. Nowadays, we take for granted machines that can play audio and video in one neat package, but in the 1920s this was the best you could do. The song Muramatsuri itself originates from a 1912 book published by the Ministry of Education and was aimed at young children, while the bouncing ball was pioneered by Max Fleischer, a Polish-American animator who created the technique in 1924. While innovation is great, incorporating varied techniques is also the mark of a good creative. And there was a lot of creativity in this period, despite Japan still recovering from the First World War and that earthquake. But how does it all come together? Let's check back in with Violet and see what our protagonist looks like.
When going into this project, the Kiwis graciously provided me not only with a mood board of inspiration, but the list of anime themselves. I really love trying to draw in other art styles and figuring out how the shapes work, but I need a decent variety of examples. The problem is, when it comes to works that are around 100 years old, there aren't too many resources to look at. I'm not sure if I ended up compositing the average protagonist with my designs, or if I just tried making a protagonist resembling that of these time periods, but in the end, I did have fun with it. In regards to the pre-war protagonist, I mostly pulled from the protagonist of Namakura Gitana when designing this character. The actual animation is both charming and a little bit jarring, and the character design of this protagonist has this like chibi, kind of exaggerated art style that's still highly detailed. I had this set of notes where I wrote, chibi but not cutesy, kind of like the Diamond is Unbreakable cursed chibis. As the other examples on the mood board had softer features, I tried to sculpt this protagonist in a similar way. His face is rounder, and he doesn't have as many realistic features as that of the protagonist of Namakura Gitana. However, I think I ended up leaning into a sort of Osumatsu-san or John Arbuckle looking guy, but this was all like subconscious. I did not do that on purpose.
I can definitely see the Namakura Gitana influence, as well as Ubasutayama and Isenbushi no Shusei. Anime of this era often used cutout animation where body parts were separate and able to be moved like a puppet. This meant that you didn't have to redraw everything for every frame, allowing for more detail than other animation of the time. Our little protagonist is a samurai with his trusty katana in hand. This is the perfect way to express the era's use of folktales and history, as well as emphasize one of the few things we knew about him. He is Japanese and he is a him. While kimono and hariri were worn regardless of gender, the more simple designs were favoured by men. Our protagonist is likely training for battle, and long sleeves and trousers would have just got in the way. His choice to wear geta instead of something more common like a jika tabi implies the rascal is a little unwilling to get dirty and prides himself on being well bred. Samurai were often landlords and had social and political power over the common man. Now we've seen him and know a little about him, what should we call him? Comment down below if you have any good ideas. We'll pick the names we like the most for all three characters. Well, the time of the samurai has settled low beyond the horizon, so let's see what awaits us with a new era and a new protagonist. Surely things will get better as technology advances and more money is invested into animation. The Warring Period is a fascinating time for anime. Animation techniques are improving, but the country is quickly militarizing. I'm excited to see how both of these elements are expressed. This era has quite a lot more anime, at 75 in a 15-ish year period, still a far cry from the 389 anime that came out in 2024. Side note, finding the total number of anime in 2024 was a pain. Seemingly nobody could agree, so I just looked at AniChart and added the 4 seasons together. Not sure if these numbers count leftovers between each season, but that's a problem for future us. But it works for illustrative purposes. Tangent over. Let's check out some 1930s anime, shall we? The first anime we have in this time period is 1931's Amiya Tanuki, or The Candyman's Raccoon Dog Dance. It's about a tanuki entertaining children by dancing and transforming. The animation is getting a lot more complex than a decade earlier. The frequency of motion is definitely increasing. I'm also like 80% sure he transforms into a minstrel show performer at one point with big round lips and white gloves. He doesn't have it in his Japanese form. If you want to learn more about minstrelsy, The Lost Crusader has a really interesting video on Japan and their relationship to the depiction of black people. 1931 also gave us Saru Masamune, the first anime to have the genre military. It's about a soldier who has to deliver a letter to his lord. On his journey, he saves a monkey and its child and is gifted a sword. He uses it to slay a boar, and then learns of a shortcut which lets him deliver the letter quickly, becoming a samurai for his deeds. All in all, it was pretty entertaining. Because of the military genre, I was actively looking for propaganda, so when the monkeys he saves start treating him with reverence, it read weird. They even go so far as to carry him around for part of his journey. Was this just for fun, or was the Japanese soldier saving natives only for them to swear loyalty to him, representing something? It pulls on a specific folklore archetype, where a person is rewarded for showing kindness to an animal. So maybe the military aspect is that he's just a soldier. However, this was made just before one of Japan's most intense periods of imperialism, so like, you know? It was directed by Murata Yasuji, who was quite prolific in the late 20s, directing Kobutori, Hanasaka Jisan, and Taku no Hone. By the 30s, the storytelling and animation of his projects had improved immensely. Murata Yasuji was a master of cutout animation. He continued directing for the next few years before leaving the door open for the next generation of Japanese animators. Kenzo Masaoka's 1931 nonsense monogatari Dai Ippen Sarugashima is surprisingly long, clocking in at just under 30 minutes. It tells the story of a boy who's raised on an island of monkeys. Kenzo Masaoka is maybe the most important person in the Warring Period. He's credited as the first to use cell animation and the first to create an anime with hard sound, an evolution of the record talkies. You might be more likely to know him as the co-founder of Nihon Doga Eiga, now known as Toei Animation. 1932's Rikoku Rikugun is fascinating. It might be the least impressive visually of all the anime we've looked at so far, but what it represents is most interesting. The English title is Armies of the World. It's about two Japanese men comparing the Japanese military to other global powers. The characters worry about potential war and Japan's military weakness. It paints a really grim picture of how the Japanese people felt at the time, reflecting the rising sentiment of nationalism in the shadow of anti-Japanese protests, such as the Shanghai incident in January of that year, after a mob attacked a group of Japanese monks in Shanghai in protest of the illegal occupation of Manchuria. Counter-riots escalated into full-scale urban warfare, where ships, planes, and thousands of men were brought into the city. Over the next month, nearly 20,000 people died, including civilians, as the battle spilled out into neighboring villages. A ceasefire was eventually agreed on by China, and 8 days later, after the League of Nations entered the negotiations, with a reluctant Japan, they also agreed. As a result, China was no longer able to have soldiers in the city, and Japan had to keep their military presence to a few units. The anime ends with the quote, "Japan is prepared to reduce its armed forces as long as the conditions remain reasonable and fair." I don't think they found the conditions reasonable and fair. I feel like Rekoku Rikugun is a turning point in anime, where the subtle themes of historical cultural power progress towards less subtle depictions of modern war and war paraphernalia. Arguably, you can still see this type of thinking in contemporary sports anime, where Japanese athletes are smaller and weaker underdogs compared to other countries. Which is why this history is important to look at if you're an anime fan. Without cultural context, you might not be able to recognize Japanese nationalism when it appears, and equally may mistake your own country's methods as being present when they're not. While you shouldn't be expected to be mentally on with all your entertainment, it's important to occasionally take some time to reflect and see if there are any concepts or themes that repeat in what you watch. A good example is 1932's Ume no Momotaro. It's about soldiers hunting a shark in their submarine. It doesn't feel like propaganda, but it does help get regular people and particularly children used to the concept of war. A notable part of the data for this era was that the average protagonist was an adult. Not only does this go against the expectation for an anime protagonist being a generic teenager, it was also priming the population to expect adults to become soldiers. Especially as from 1927 to 1945, Japan had a military draft. Those characters could be your brother or father or uncle. And don't worry, look how much fun they're having hunting marine animals on a cool boat. 1933's Nurakuro Shoei Nichiyobi no Kajiken feels like it's doing this too, with anti-aircraft guns and planes and parachutes. Actually, Nurakuro is definitely a product of propaganda. He's a soldier in an army heavily based on the Imperial Japanese Army. The mangaka, Sui Hotagawa, was a conscript in Korea and Manchuria before going to art school. As the manga progressed, it starts to tell the story of Nuroko's military exploits against the Pigs Army on the continent. Like I said, the propaganda becomes less subtle the closer we get to Japan entering World War II in 1939. Nurakuro was put on hiatus in 1941 because the military needed that paper for ammo or something. However, this was several years after other manga, which speaks to its importance as a propaganda tool. Nurakuro started as more of a gag manga, and it's hard to tell if its shift to propaganda was a reflection of Tagawa's shifting beliefs or a man who wanted to keep his job. Tensions throughout Japan increased during the 1930s, coming to a head in 1937 with a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. This coincides with the data in a really interesting way. You can clearly see consistent anime releases up until 1936, and then in 1937 our data only shows one anime, Katsurahime. Katsurahime is really interesting in its own right, but we'll get to that. 1938 only has one anime, and then Japan joins World War II on the side of the Axis. 1938 through 1941 has very little anime, and none of it is military focused. And then from 1942, the propaganda and military anime ramp right up until the end of the war. The war impacted the production of anime, as more resources were dedicated to the war effort. So this increase in propaganda anime in 1942 is really interesting. My theory is that Japan was struggling from this period to the end of the war and wanted to project power to its people. The anime depict heroic Japanese soldiers or conniving Western forces, the one exception being Kyoruko Bokusen, that was intended to teach people how to extinguish different types of incendiary bombs. However, despite educating people on how to act during air raid sirens, there is still an emphasis on victory, with the army proceeding to shoot down all the planes and returning peace to the land. 4 months before Japan's surrender, Momotaro Ume no Shinpei, the first feature-length anime, was released. Momotaro is the most impressive anime so far, and especially at this length. Much like a lot of the anime of this period, it has quite a cute art style, implying the intended audience is children. To really hammer that home, the movie ends with children pretending to be paratroopers invading America. It feels like a message for the next generation. The depiction of English people is particularly funny to us for its unflatteringness. The juxtaposition between the cute Japanese characters and the tall, fat, ugly foreigners is a deliberate decision too. And another example of Japanese media depicting Japanese people as small and weak. This movie was directed by Mitsuyo Seo, who was ordered to make it by the Japanese Naval Ministry. It's a sequel to Momotaro's Sea Eagles, where the titular Momotaro attacks Pearl Harbor. Its impressive visuals are possibly because it was directly sponsored as propaganda. so they had the time and manpower to make it as good as they could. There's even a scene done in cutout animation by Kenzo Masaoka. Mitsuyo Seo is a very interesting figure too, but we've looked at a lot of history, so let's take a break, check back in with Dark Violet, and have a look at the character all of this inspired.
The key feature of the Warring Period protagonist is that he is a piece of war propaganda. With examples showing both samurai and soldiers, the art style leaned into a bit more of a realistically proportioned protagonist compared to the pre-war characters. I made my character with the mindset of him looking like an approachable yet formidable soldier. He is a very friendly face to a very unfriendly regime. I felt a little uncomfortable designing this character. I almost made him a sushi chef because of one of the example images, but pivoted to fit the wartime theme. And it feels weird trying to create a character that reflects literally World War II era Japan. I do not want to glorify or soften how horrible the war was, try to whitewash how gross the propaganda could be. This design is my least favorite out of the 3 that I made for this video, mostly because of this overthinking I had over the design. Also, I don't know, his hair, he's balding.
The Warring Period protagonist is impressively accurate to the way characters of the era were designed. He's an adult, but cute, so he appeals to all ages. He is overtly a military man, but the hairstyle appeals to a traditionalism, the same way using Momotaro did. It's sort of like if Beowulf went off to kill Grendel, but Grendel was a World War II panzer, and Beowulf had a machine gun. Our military man is proportioned, but simple and easy to animate for long propaganda pieces. His uniform is neat and orderly because he is a good soldier who represents the goodness of the great nation of Japan. Violet's apprehension is understandable. This is a representation of a lot of atrocities, as well as a deliberate attempt from a government to manipulate its people into being okay with that. Arguably, Japan was very successful in this, with even contemporary Japanese people denying the country's war crimes. Incorporating symbols such as the rising sun flag or depicting real-life war criminals is a lot to ask of our artist. But equally, we can depict these things in a different context to condemn them or remove meaning if wanted. This can be positive and negative because nothing in life is simple, especially not war. The tight control of context by the Japanese government convinced several generations they were blameless weak people just defending themselves. That's a hard thing to embody in a single character design, and a hard thing to segue from.
The Warring Period has quite a lot more female protagonists compared to the pre-war period. The earliest is Cho no Sainan in 1931, and the last is Ari-chan in 1941 by Mitsuyo Seo. There are 6 in total, but that's more than the other 2 eras combined. Ari-chan was the first anime to use a multi-plane camera for the whole film. This allowed them to create a more realistic sense of depth and parallax by moving images longer than the aspect ratio in front of the camera. This helped to make effective animation for cheaper because you did one long drawing instead of a dozen smaller ones. Layers are another one of those digital art processes that were originally used in traditional art but then forgotten about. There is a tendency to deride digital art as cheap and easy, but artists spend a lot of time trying to make better art, and sometimes that means building a saw trap with a camera mounted on it and convincing 6 of your close friends to carefully orchestrate moving panes of glass to make it look like some trees move real good. Interestingly, Ari-chan was financed by the Ministry of Education. The powers that be in Japan clearly saw the potential of animation to influence children, for better or worse. It's interesting that Seo is best known for his propaganda because he was a leftist when he was younger. Before starting his own company, he helped Kenzo Masaoka create the first anime with hard sound, Chikara Onna no Yo no Naka. After the war, he returned to making leftist pro-democracy media even if the country wasn't ready for them. I find it's important to remember that most propaganda has to be made by some kind of artist. Sometimes artists work on projects they don't necessarily believe in. This is not to say these works are innocent, but that often the victims include those pressured to defy their own ethics under threat and coercion. After his final anime project, 1949's The King's Tale, failed to cover its costs, Seo retired from animation and started illustrating children's books. He died in Jesus, 2010 at 99 years old. He outlived Osamu Tezuka by 21 years. Tezuka, who was inspired by Seo's work as a teenager. It's almost a little scary that some of the people who worked on these projects were alive at the same time as me. It makes World War II feel a lot more recent than I like to think it was. This period did have its fair share of non-propaganda works. For example, 1933's Kekaku Yobu, an anime about preventing tuberculosis, or 1935's Propagate, an abstract anime about growing plants, or 1937's Katsurahime, a story about bandits capturing a princess. This anime is particularly notable for us because of the behind-the-scenes documentary that was made. Not only is it amazing stock footage for this video, it also helps us get an actual look at the processes artists were using at the time. The director Nobuo Ufuji was determined to bring color to the moving picture. He tried multiple methods, such as using colored filters and traditional patterned Chiogami paper. The warring period brought so much progress to the medium of animation in Japan. From Murata Yasuji to Kenzo Masaoka to Nobuo Ufuji to Mitsuyo Seo and many more. The artists of this time innovated and pushed animation forward even if they had less resources in a land at war. There's so much more to touch on too, like Evil Mickey Mouse in Omocho Bako's series Dai 3 wa Ehon 1936 nen, or how Felix the Cat's introduction in Japan helped inspire Norakuro. But if we want to get this video out before the end of the year, I think we should move on to the post-war period and our final protagonist. The war is over and peace has returned to the land, right? Rebuilding took its toll on Japan as a whole, but also the animation industry. Japan was under Allied military occupation from the end of the war in 1945 to 1952. During this period of occupation, our data shows 11 anime, the earliest being 1946's Mahou no Pen, directed by Masao Kumogawa. It's about a boy who finds a magic pen and uses said pen to help rebuild his war-torn home. The short film ends with him waking up from his dream and heading out into the ruined town with a sense of optimism. Despite the obvious propaganda at play, there is a sense that you cannot just magically fix everything, which is an appreciated level of realism. However, it is equally likely that it's trying to instill a sense of responsibility on those left behind to fix the damage done. So like, go get that job in construction, we have idealized American skyscrapers to build. This anime also depicts a woman driving and making her own decisions. In 1945, the American president pressured the Japanese government to give women the right to vote. However, the occupying soldiers had to be placated with prostitutes to stop them from raping local women. So instead of raping random women, they instead violated some thousands of women who were coerced into the work in exchange for food and clothes. They also removed old censorship laws and replaced them with new pro-American censorship that forbade criticizing America and also indicating that you were censoring information such as putting redacted or blocking out text. This would explain why Mahou no Pen is so American in its presentation. The future of Japan was America. And while the occupation ended after 7 years in 1952, the American military still has a heavy presence in Okinawa and a light presence throughout the country, down from 500,000 at its height during the occupation to a measly 50,000. Not to say it was just America, the British Commonwealth including Britain, India, Australia and New Zealand were also there. The occupation also sought to reform Japan on a fundamental societal level, encouraging unions, improving conditions and throwing 2 million tons of munitions into the sea. Despite this, many jobs were lost, especially animators, but others were able to persist despite this. In 1947, Kenzo Masaoka directed Sutaneko Torachan, a very well animated anime about a lost kitten. Masaoka revisits Torachan 2 more times, in 1948 with Torachan no Hanayome, and in 1950 with Torachan no Kankan Mushi, the latter being his final directorial credit. During the occupation, anime was very cute, in tone and visually. The protagonists were mostly children and often animals. We also see a return to retellings and folklore with far less set in the modern era. When they are rarely human, which could speak to a sense of detachment from being human. This is just a trend, of course. After the occupation ended in 1952, the economy expanded rapidly, allowing for increased anime output. Animators like Tadahito Mochinaga, who had previously worked on anime like Ari-chan and Momotaro's Sea Eagles, had the freedom to experiment. During the war, he developed his own style of puppeteering, using whatever he could scavenge. He used those skills to make anime anime like Go Hiki no Kozaru Tachi and Oriko Hime to Amanojaku in 1956. He also worked on Beer Mukashi Mukashi, the first commercial to use stop motion in Japan. It incorporates live action and cell animation as well. Very mixed media, very cool, Tadahito. 1954's Hana to Cho is very cute, but also has color for its entirety. And wouldn't you know it, it's Nobuo Ufuji again. That guy really wanted color anime to happen in his lifetime, and by Jove did he make that happen. I've been researching for so long at this point that when I check out the stuff on a project and spot a name I recognize, I get excited. He also directed 1956's Yuri-sen, a gorgeous anime about a flying ship. In the 50s, and with a free Japan, we see a massive increase in anime quality. Anime of this decade are finally good enough to simply be fun to watch beyond historical curiosity. A lot of very early anime is good for its time, but anime like Kaneko no Rakugaki in 1957 is just good. Directed by Yabushita Taiji at Toei Animation. It's about a young cat who loves making art. His pencil gets stolen by mice, and he has to enter the world of his drawings to get it back. I particularly enjoy the scene where they're just little dots chasing each other around. Its sequel 1959's Kaneko no Studio is also a really fun little watch. Instead of drawing, our little cat is a film director, and instead of Yabushita Taiji, the sequel was directed by Mori Yasuji, the storyboarder and key animator for Rakugaki. Speaking of cute cats, for no reason at all, I think now might be a good time to check back in with Dark Violet and our final protagonist.
Out of the three designs, I think the post-war protagonist is my favorite. Coming up with a kitty character based on old fairy tales was so much fun. I really love the trapezoidal and oval shapes of the cat characters in the examples, with these big foreheads and chunky cheeks. The cat with the teal scarf and the cat with the overalls are probably my favorite of these example designs. However, that one human kid with the snapback upsets me greatly, and I want to draw a tic-tac-toe board on his big-ass forehead. My take on the post-war protagonist is a sort of cat boy version of Pinocchio. I'm Italian, I gotta put in that spicy spaghetti, mamma mia. Mamma mia, mamma mia. I'm also not well versed in Japanese fables. The Kiwis informed me that these anime don't just touch on Japanese fables, but stories from all around the world, so my Pinocchio meow fits right in. The Scarf Cat and Snapback Kid both have these half-moon shaped eyes with a thick upper eyelid that I think is a rather cute design, and I knew from the start that I wanted to include that in my protagonist.
This protagonist is my favourite too. He perfectly encapsulates the trends of the era, and the cuteness that overflows from anime like Kaneko no Studio and Tora-chan. Looking at the data, he is, like the other two, also a him, with black hair and black eyes. I think our protagonist might be breaking the colour trend, but he's cute, so it's fine. Unlike the pre-war protagonist, who had no specific age, or the warring protagonist who was an adult, the post-war protagonist is a child. A fair chunk of anime in this period evoke early Disney works. That includes the animal protagonists. 6 out of the 26 protagonists are cats, and at least half are non-human. Towards the end of the decade, experimentation continued, and teams grew larger. Perhaps there was more investment into the animation industry, I don't know that for sure though. What I do know is that anime was getting global attention, and would soon be getting released in the West. 1958's Yumemi Doji is considered to be one of the first Toei Doga anime in color. The anime is a musical of sorts, and features a lot of traditionally dressed women, which is exactly what I would expect from the director, Fukiya Koji. Instead of anime, he was much more known for his illustrations of women in shoujo magazines. It was actually really difficult to find a credible source about his time working in animation. Even the British Museum was only interested in his work as an illustrator. Toei was in full swing in the late 50s, also producing Hakujaden in 1958, the first anime feature film in full color. The team working on this project was stacked. It was directed by Yabushita Taiji, the key animation was by Mori Yasuji and Utsuka Yasuo, and the in-betweens were done by Rintaro, also known as Hayashi Shigeyuki, and Okuyama Reiko, just to name a few. I had no idea how important these people were to anime before working on this video. Researching anime in general has given us a mild annoyance at Osamu Tezuka, mostly just because everything supposedly goes back to him as far as Western perception is concerned. And it just doesn't. There were so many animators that helped pave the way for what Tezuka did. He's just the most successful and well known. But when looking into things, you have to have a little doubt in your heart. Is that the truth? Did that really happen? Surely one man alone did not start everything in an industry that was up and running before he was even born. Mori Yasuji was key in developing the style of early Toei. Isao Takahata has been quoted as saying, "Mori's influence on the world of Japanese animation was incalculable." Speaking of Studio Ghibli, Utsuka Yasuo mentored both Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki. He also experimented with a lot of frame rate during his time at Toei. This experimentation directly led to the creation of the money shot, known by Western fans as Sakuga. Rintaro went on to be the co-founder of Madhouse, and lastly, Okutama Reiko was one of the first female Japanese animators that we know of. Any of these artists could have a whole video dedicated to them. But maybe that's not for us to do. Maybe you, dear viewer, could take a crack at this and spend 3 months going down a rabbit hole and try and make your own video on one of these amazing artists. The team that worked on Hakujaden then went on to create the final anime in our data, 1959's Shonen Sarutobi Sasuke, known in English as The Adventures of Little Samurai or Magic Boy. I guess the translators thought the concept of a ninja and yokai was too complex for Western audiences. Shonen Sarutobi Sasuke was the first anime to be released in theaters in the US, followed by Hakujaden a month later. The best part about experiencing media from another culture is that it's from another culture. I don't need yokai to become wizards or dokubi to become goblins. Please tell me about things I do not know and how they matter to you and the art that you make. Books can have footnotes and anime can have translators' notes on screen, but apparently that's too much effort. Check out this cool blog post explaining the evolution of anime subtitles and how much Crunchyroll sucks. Most of these decisions are made by higher-ups who rely on an audience that is uncurious and willing to accept whatever they're given. If you're watching anime in 2025, you can definitely stop for a moment and Google what a ninja is, or why it's probably not great that every anime adaptation of a Korean property is treated like shit. But that sounds like conclusion talk, so let's head into the conclusion. This video was so much fun to work on. Anime of this era are so fascinating to look at. Watching these anime and researching the time period that they were produced has given me a much greater appreciation for all the work these artists put into developing their craft. As we mentioned, so much of this time period is skipped when people in the West talk about early anime. It's 50-ish years. Skipping it is like if I wanted to write a video on Western animation, then skipped Mickey Mouse and started talking about the Flintstones. It gives an incomplete picture. Tezuka is a very easy starting point, but an inaccurate one. Perhaps the moral complexity of a Japan at war leads people to ignore the period. Not to say everyone ignores these anime, we found a fair few really interesting blog posts and articles written on the topic, but for a lot of this video we had to read up on the history, watch the anime, scour the internet, and construct the history like a puzzle with the data as our guide. It makes it all the more valuable to collate the information in an accessible format. Not only this video, but both the spreadsheet and the sources are freely available through our Google Drive. The more we research history, the more we want to create some sort of archive of everything and put it in a bunker deep underground where earthquakes and time won't touch it. But until we become popular enough to afford a remote land in Siberia, you can help by taking and sharing the information here, be that using our data or correcting us in the things we've got wrong, especially if you're Japanese. Even better, you should make a YouTube video and then tag us. We also have our own perspectives. The history we told and the characters we created were made by the three of us. We each have our own lens through which we view the world.
The biggest challenge of this art project really was trying to come up with design motifs from such a small pool of examples. Mimicking the art styles had to be the most enjoyable part of the process, though. I really enjoyed it. I think for future installments of this project, these sentiments would probably be flipped. With more examples of anime, I'll be able to come up with average designs more effectively, rather than creating my own version of like one specific guy that may fit in the era. However, I will need to figure out a new way of rendering the characters. My typical art style is rather painterly, and I heavily rely on the rendering process to make things look good.
The three characters Violet created for us represent three different periods in Japanese history. They represent many people's lives and a life's work. The first tells a tale of progress. Animation was new and they wanted to tell stories. The second tells a tale of a land at war, and the lengths artists will go to continue creating. And the last tells a tale of a tentative piece. Anime wasn't really an industry yet, I needed someone to come along and steal all the glory. But that someone is next video talk. What about this video? What did we actually learn and prove from the vague hypothesis that all anime protagonists are average-looking Japanese teenage boys? For gender, it was male by a mile for all 49 years. Even if we included every other gender and counted all the various ones individually, and then assumed the gender of animals, it would still be male. This definitely reflects the people making the anime. The focus on soldiers during the warring period also skews this to male. The post-war did see 3 anime with both male and female protagonists. 2 were young, likely appealing to children of both genders, and the third is Adam and Eve. Women were, however, present even in the earliest anime, Kanimanji Enji in 1925 specifically. I think it's important to note that while it was a bit of a boys' club on and off the screen, that doesn't mean there were only men. We have 10 female protagonists, so 7.6% of our protag-kuns were actually protag-chans. Super excited to see how this number changes in the future. Surely it won't get lower, right? For a lot of the anime, we could only find some production information, and so only talked about the directors. They would have had teams, and their work goes entirely uncredited. As was often the case, these teams consisted of men and women, especially during the war. I have no doubt that women worked on these projects. We mention Okutama Reiko as one of the first female animators only because that's how she's referred to.
People sometimes bemoan how long credits on movies are these days, and why catering or accountants are there at all. But I think it does an audience good to understand how many people are needed in a project. Bit of a tangent, but I used to work in a warehouse, and one day I had to fill an order that was expected to take exactly 60 minutes. Because lifting boxes is boring as fuck, I spent most of that time thinking, in particular about how much my pay was in comparison to how much all those products would be sold for. But I also knew before they got to me, they had to be put in the warehouse, and before that, they were packaged. I thought back along all the steps of the logistics chain until I got to farmers and other primary industries. And then I thought forwards to where they would go after I placed the pallet. The person who would move them into the lorries, the drivers of said lorries, and the workers who would stack the shelves and sell the products. I was a very small cog in a very big machine, but that's just how logistics works. I probably missed a dozen steps in my thoughts, such as nutritionists or marketers and whatnot, but the point was that I came out of that hour with a more holistic understanding of how nothing is done by just one person. The 1999 children's book, Beans on Toast by Paul Dowling, is a great introduction to the economics of logistics that a lot of people would do good to read. But equally, I feel this video is a meditation on these same concepts. Anime isn't made by one director or one animator. A lot of people contributed techniques and technology, and all of that came together over the years. Learning the history and how many thousands of people are forever captured in every part of anime is a little comforting. Society as a whole is founded on everyone who came before us. This was supposed to be a video on century-old anime protagonists, but without all this interesting history, what would this data actually tell us?
There was so much more we could go into, but we really wanted to post this video by the end of the year. Maybe in upcoming videos, we can talk about the difference between cellulose and celluloid in cell animation, or how smear frames came to be. But even if we don't, hopefully your curiosity will take you there on your own. But please stay with us a little longer. Only 3 protagonists had hair that wasn't black. This is skewed by the black and white nature of these films, but as anyone who reads manga would know, there can be implications of other hair colors, like blonde and blue. The 2 blondes are actually Kaneko from Kaneko no Studio and Kaneko from Kaneko no Rakugaki, who is noticeably not a black cat, even in grayscale. The blue-haired character is green-haired, so apparently I'm colorblind. Either way, this marks our first character to have vibrant anime hair. In 1955's Onbu Obake. Eye color is pretty much the same, except with a few blue eyes and a magical ninja samurai boy Sasuke who has explicitly brown eyes and black hair. But this is also a great reminder that averages are just average. Many anime were entirely different to the statistical calculations of a half-century of data. So while there were a lot of black-haired, black-eyed Japanese boys, sometimes there were also crabs and cats and whales and boats and women. Age was very hard to define in this era, so this is the data I have the least faith in. Most of it was contained contextual, or we went by descriptions. I was still surprised by how many were adults. Almost as many protagonists were adults as children. We even have some old guys and some young adults. But I can't wait for actual age numbers to get involved in future videos. Arguably this is because teenagers hadn't really been invented yet, but it's also obviously because these anime were made with other demographics in mind, namely children and a nation at war. Two of our protagonists are adults with jobs and one is a kitten. Sexual orientation was fairly worthless at this point in time. We have 11 heterosexuals, and even then that's an assumption based on a character having a spouse of the opposite gender. More heterosexuals than women though. Not much to say here for this data, but the fact there is no data shows that romance as a genre wasn't something these early animators wanted to focus on. We have one romance anime, and even then it's a secondary genre, and the plot is about marriage and status rather than love. A lot of these labels are retroactive, and so there's a level of conformity that doesn't necessarily line up with the reality of these anime. But the same could be said of modern anime. That's why subgenres and themes exist. But mostly it's just a small piece of info for you to get a sort of understanding of what something's about. Only 35% of these anime have a second genre, which could be a sign of their small scale and simplicity, or that it was hard enough to pick one genre and no one cares to update 100-year-old Mal listings. They will, however, leave reviews telling you to not bother with all this fascinating history because it's boring and has no sound. If you are one of those people, and you have somehow found this video, go and change your review right now. Look at the weight of all of this history and tell me you wouldn't recommend the foundation of this medium we all love. A big thank you to Dark Violet Cloud for his art, perspective, and the ability to spell. Make sure you subscribe to his YouTube channel and check out his comic linked in the description. This video, as usual, took us longer to make than expected, but hopefully it was worth it.
I'd like to say one last thank you to the Kiwis for reaching out to me. I'm having a lot of fun with this and look forward to working with you two again in the future. Note, do not mention how you are locked in the basement with nothing but ramen noodles and you'll be rewarded with 1 hour of sunlight exposure.
We streamed a lot of the editing over on the second channel, and the Patreon got regular work in progress uploads. If you enjoyed and want to help push us to make more and more complex videos, then feel free to support us on Patreon. But most importantly, it would mean a lot to us if you liked and shared the video. These videos take ages, and any help pushing them to more people would be massively appreciated. Also, honestly, thank God for YouTube channels that bother to upload early anime, because modern streaming sites don't, and neither do the pirate ones. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next, hopefully shorter video. Bye bye!